3, there are seasons when pressure feels unusually concentrated, not because one challenge has appeared, but because multiple forms of resistance seem to arrive at once. A layer of emotional exhaustion, a wave of uncertainty, a sense of disruption that feels heavier than ordinary difficulty. These are the moments when pressure no longer feels isolated. It feels layered. One issue alone can often be managed with clarity. But when challenges begin stacking together, the experience changes. Mental energy becomes divided. Focus weakens. Emotional capacity begins to feel stretched. And when this happens, the mind naturally begins searching for explanation. Why does everything suddenly feel heavier? Why does clarity seem harder to maintain? Why does peace feel less accessible than before? These questions often arise because concentrated pressure changes perception. What might otherwise feel manageable begins to feel amplified. This is one of the effects of sustained intensity. It narrows focus. Attention becomes increasingly drawn toward what feels unstable. The mind begins scanning for threats, anticipating further disruption, and trying to regain a sense of control. This is unexplainable. When multiple forms of pressure are present, the internal system often shifts into protective mode. Hyper-awareness increases. Rest becomes more difficult. Emotional recovery slows. And over time, if this continues, internal stability can begin to erode. Not necessarily through one dramatic event, but through cumulative strain. This is why Psalm 46 begins exactly where it does. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. This opening is strategic. Before addressing instability, it establishes foundation. Before discussing fear, it introduces refuge. Before acknowledging trouble, it defines strength. This order matters, because under pressure, attention tends to move immediately toward what feels threatening. The problem becomes central. The instability becomes central. The uncertainty becomes central. And once pressure becomes the central focus, internal experience often begins organizing around it. Thought loops increase. Emotional intensity rises. Perspective narrows further. Psalm 46 interrupts this pattern immediately. It redirects attention, not first toward the problem, but toward the stronghold. A stronghold is more than a temporary shelter. It represents reinforced stability, a place designed to withstand pressure, a structure built not merely for comfort, but for protection under conditions of threat or instability. This image is powerful, because when life feels unstable, the deepest need is often not immediate explanation, it is stabilizing structure, something stronger than surrounding conditions. Something not shifting every time circumstances fluctuate. Something capable of holding steady when internal and external pressure increase simultaneously. This is what refuge represents. A stable reference point. And reference points are essential. Without a stable reference point, perception becomes easily shaped by the loudest force in the environment. If chaos is loudest, chaos begins defining interpretation. If pressure is loudest, pressure begins shaping emotional climate. But a stronghold changes this. It creates another center, a place where attention can reorganize, where internal systems can begin recalibrating, where strength is not generated through forceful resistance alone, but through reconnection with stability. This is why the verse also includes strength. God is over. Our refuge and strength. Refuge protects. Strength enables. Protection alone is incomplete without restoration of capacity. Because prolonged pressure often drains capacity. Mental endurance decreases. Patience becomes thinner. Clarity becomes harder to sustain. This is not necessarily weakness. It is depletion. And depletion changes performance. Even simple decisions can begin feeling heavier under sustained strain. This is why strength is essential. Not merely external protection, but internal reinforcement. Strength restores functional ability. The ability to think clearly. The ability to remain emotionally regulated. The ability to continue moving intentionally despite surrounding instability. This is what makes Psalm 46 so psychologically powerful. It does not promise absence of trouble. It promises presence within trouble. A very present help. Present is critical. Not distant help. Not delayed support. Not abstract reassurance. But present help. This addresses one of the deepest fears under pressure. Isolation. When difficulty intensifies, it often feels as though support has become less accessible. Problems feel immediate. Solutions feel distant. But Psalm 46 directly counters this perception. Help is not described as theoretical. It is present. Accessible within the moment of pressure. This changes the emotional experience of instability, because pressure feels different when there is perceived support. Even if circumstances remain challenging, the presence of a stable support structure changes internal response. Stress decreases, capacity increases, perspective broadens. This is why strongholds matter. Not because they eliminate all external challenges instantly, but because they prevent external instability from becoming total internal collapse. This is the hook of Psalm 46. When everything feels layered, amplified, or unusually heavy, the first move is not surrendering to pressure's interpretation. It is returning to foundation, returning to what is stable, returning to what does not fluctuate with every changing condition. Because chaos is often loud, but loudness is not authority. Pressure can be intense, but intensity is not permanence. And instability, no matter how overwhelming it appears, does not automatically deserve control over internal climate. Psalm 46 begins by restoring perspective. There is still refuge. There is still strength. There is still stabilizing presence available even in trouble. And once that truth is reestablished, something shifts internally. Breathing becomes easier. Thought becomes less fragmented. Attention begins reorganizing away from panic and back towards structure. This is the first victory. Not the removal of every challenge immediately, but the restoration of internal grounding strong enough to prevent pressure from becoming the sole defining force of the moment. That is what makes God the stronghold, not escape from reality, but stability powerful enough to hold firm while everything else feels under attack. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea. Psalm 46 now moves from establishing refuge to defining response. This progression is important. A strong foundation changes how instability is interpreted. Once refuge is established, response no longer has to be dictated entirely by surrounding conditions. This is why the verse begins with therefore. It signals conclusion based on previous truth. Because refuge exists, fear is no longer the automatic goal, the earning principle. This does not mean the absence of disruption. In fact, the imagery here is extreme. The earth being removed, mountains carried into the sea. These are symbols of structural instability. Things normally associated with permanence are being described as shifting. This is intentional. Mountains represent solidity, reliability, and immovable structure. The earth represents foundation itself. By describing these as unstable, Psalm 46 acknowledges the unsettling reality that even what once seemed predictable can sometimes feel shaken. This is a deeply human experience. There are moments when assumptions no longer feel secure. What once felt dependable begins to change. What once felt structured begins to feel uncertain. What once created confidence begins to feel unstable. This is often when chaos becomes psychologically powerful, not simply because change occurs, but because change affects perceived foundation. When foundations feel threatened, the internal system often reacts intensely. Certainty decreases. Control feels reduced. Future orientation becomes less clear. And this is fertile ground for fear. Fear thrives in uncertainty. It attempts to prep for instability by increasing vigilance. Scanning intensifies. Threat awareness increases. Worst case scenario thinking becomes more active. This is understandable. Fear is often an attempt to regain control through anticipation. If enough risks are identified, perhaps disruption can be avoided. But sustained fear has costs. It narrows cognitive bandwidth. Attention becomes consumed by instability. Perspective contracts. Decision-making becomes more reactive. Over time, fear can begin functioning as an organizing principle. Not because danger is always present, but because uncertainty remains central. This is why Psalm 46 directly addresses fear. Therefore, we will not fear. This is not denial. It is decision. A refusal to allow instability to become the primary internal authority. This distinction matters. Fear is often treated as unavoidable whenever conditions feel uncertain. But Psalm 46 introduces a different possibility. External instability does not require internal surrender. Circumstances may shift, conditions may fluctuate, structures may feel less predictable, but internal orientation can remain anchored. This is what refusing fear means here. Not the elimination of emotion, but the refusal to let emotion become governance. Fear may arise, but it does not automatically deserve control. This is a major shift. Because once fear is no longer assumed to be the rightful leader under uncertainty, space opens for a different internal posture. a posture of steadiness. Steadiness is not passivity. It is regulated presence under changing conditions. The ability to remain functionally aligned even when the environment feels less stable. This is incredibly powerful because chaos often seeks movement. Not only external movement, but internal displacement, confusion, emotional volatility, fragmented thinking. Chaos becomes most influential when it successfully relocates internal stability, when clarity is replaced with reaction, when focus is replaced with fragmentation. This is what it means to be moved by chaos. Not merely experiencing disruption, but allowing disruption to redefine internal state. Psalm 46 rejects this. Chaos may exist, but it is not granted full access to internal climate. This is strength, not preventing all instability externally, but maintaining stronger order internally. This internal order, error changes response quality. A regulated system thinks differently, less impulsivity, less catastrophic interpretation, less unnecessary escalation, more clarity, more measured action, more capacity to distinguish between actual challenge and fear amplified perception. This distinction is crucial because fear often enlarges instability psychologically. What is difficult may begin feeling impossible. What is uncertain may begin feeling catastrophic. This is why anchored perspective matters. A stable internal frame reduces distortion. It allows reality to be assessed more accurately, not minimized, not exaggerated, simply seen more clearly. This is one of the greatest advantages of refusing to be moved. Clarity is preserved, and preserved clarity supports better navigation, better decisions, better emotional regulation, better continuity under pressure. This is not only spiritually powerful, it is structurally intelligent. Because the less internal disruption chaos can create, the less overall damage it can produce. External challenges may still require attention, but internal fragmentation is reduced. And reduced fragmentation increases resilience. This is the deeper power of this verse. Even if symbolic mountains move, internal anchoring remains possible. Even if previously stable conditions shift, identity and orientation do not have to collapse with them. This is liberation from chaos-based living. No longer emotionally reorganized every time circumstances fluctuate. No longer mentally displaced by every wave of uncertainty. Instead, grounded, measured, anchored. This is what Psalm 46 is teaching. Refuge creates a basis for non-reactivity, not numbness, not detachment, but disciplined internal stability. A system no longer automatically controlled by external intensity. This changes everything, because once chaos loses its ability to move internal structure, it loses much of its psychological power. It may still be loud, but loudness is not leadership. It may still be disruptive, but disruption is not ultimate authority. And once that truth becomes stable internally, something powerful happens. Fear begins losing its organizing role. Calm begins returning. Clarity becomes more accessible again. This is what it means to refuse movement by chaos. Not pretending instability does not exist, but remaining rooted still. Only enough that instability no longer determines the internal direction of thought, emotion, or forward movement. There is a river whose stream shall make glad the city of God. After describing chaos, instability, and shaking foundations, Psalm 46 introduces a completely different image. A river. This shift is deliberate. The psalm moves from intensity to flow, from disruption to continuity, from external turbulence to an internal source of sustained movement. This contrast matters because pressure often creates the illusion that everything is unstable. When intensity rises, attention becomes naturally drawn toward disruption. What is loud feels central. What is chaotic feels dominant. What is uncertain feels all-encompassing. And under these conditions, it can begin to seem as though instability is the only reality present. But Psalm 46 interrupts this perception. There is a river, even while chaos is being acknowledged. Another reality is introduced simultaneously. Flow still exists. This is significant because one of the most destabilizing effects of pressure is the belief that continuity has been interrupted completely. That peace is inaccessible. That ability is unavailable. That forward movement has stopped. But the river represents continuity. Movement that remains active regardless of surrounding instability. A river does not wait for all conditions to become ideal before it flows. It moves through varying environments, quiet spaces, rocky terrain, changing landscapes, and yet it continues. This is the image Psalm 46 provides. Not merely stillness, but sustained internal flow. Flow here symbolizes life force, nourishment, continuity, and ongoing stability. This matters psychologically because pressure often creates internal rigidity. When stress increases, systems tighten, thought becomes more constricted, emotion becomes more compressed, flexibility decreases. The mind often moves toward control strategies, tightening focus, reducing perceived vulnerability, holding everything more rigidly. This is understandable, but prolonged rigidity is exhausting. It reduces adaptability, and adaptability is essential under pressure. This is why the river image is so powerful. The river is not rigid. It is structured movement, not chaotic motion, not uncontrolled force, but directional continuity. This is what Alpha internal systems often need under pressure, not greater rigidity, but stronger regulated flow. The ability to continue processing, adapting, and moving without freezing. This is resilience, not absence of difficulty, but continued functional movement within difficulty. This is what the streams do. They shall make glad the city of God. Gladness here is more than emotional positivity. It suggests restoration, refreshment, stabilization, and strengthening of what the city represents. A city is a system, organized, structured, protected. The city symbolizes an internal framework, and the streams nourish it. This is important because systems require replenishment. No system can sustain prolonged output without renewal. Under chronic pressure, depletion increases, energy lowers, patience weakens, attention fatigue. Without replenishment, even strong systems begin degrading over time. This is why the river matters. It represents continuous replenishment, not one isolated moment of relief, but ongoing access to renewal. This is critical because many people approach stability as if it can be maintained through sheer force. Just push harder, try harder, hold, LD everything together manually. But sustained strength rarely comes from force alone. It requires nourishment. Resources flowing into the system, restoration, perspective, emotional recalibration. The river provides this image, a source not dependent on surrounding conditions. This is perhaps the most powerful element. The river exists while chaos still exists. This means stability does not require the total disappearance of disruption before becoming available. This changes everything because often the mind postpones stability. I will feel stable when circumstances improve. That I will feel peace when everything is resolved. But Psalm 46 suggests otherwise. The river is present now, in the middle of instability, not after it. This means access to flow is not contingent on perfect conditions. It is available concurrently with challenge. This is psychologically freeing because it removes the assumption that external order must fully precede internal order. Instead, internal flow can coexist with external disruption. This is maturity of regulation, not waiting for all uncertainty to disappear before accessing steadiness, but learning to maintain continuity within imperfect conditions. This is what resilient systems do. They continue flowing, not without challenge, but without total interruption. This is why rivers are powerful symbols. They bypass obstacles, adapt around resistance, continue moving despite changing terrain. This flexibility is strength, not fragility, not passivity, but dynamic continuity. This is what Psalm 46 invites. A return to internal flow, less rigidity, less fragmentation, less total identification with chaos. Instead, movement, breathing space, restoration of internal circulation, reconnection to ongoing stability. This changes the emotional atmosphere. Pressure may remain, but it no longer defines the whole environment because another force is active. The river, quiet perhaps, less dramatic than chaos, but more sustainable, more nourishing, more structurally stabilizing. And over time, what nourishes consistently often proves stronger than what merely disrupts loudly. This is the deeper wisdom here. Chaos often captures attention because it is loud, but the river sustains because it is continuous. And continuity often wins over intensity. This is the promise embedded in PSA. LM 46. Even in seasons of pressure, depletion, or instability, internal continuity remains possible. There is still flow, still replenishment, still access to what strengthens the inner system. And once reconnection to that flow begins, something changes. Tension starts softening. Thought becomes less constricted. The internal environment begins stabilizing again. Not because chaos has fully disappeared, but because the river is still flowing. And where the river flows, continuity remains stronger than disruption, making stability possible even in the middle of pressure. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. Psalm 46 now turns attention inward again, moving from external imagery back to internal stability. This is a critical transition, because external pressure often becomes most effective when it successfully disrupts internal order. Challenges alone are not always what create the greatest difficulty. Often, it is the internal fragmentation that follows. A problem may be manageable, but a problem combined with confusion feels heavier. Pressure combined with mental instability becomes far more difficult to navigate. This is why fear and confusion are powerful destabilizers. Fear narrows perception. It increases focus on threat while decreasing access to broader perspective. It makes immediate concerns feel larger, more urgent, and more emotionally dominant. This can be useful in brief moments of acute danger, but under sustained pressure, chronic fear becomes exhausting. Attention remains hyper-focused. The mind keeps scanning for what could go wrong next. Rest becomes difficult. Clarity becomes harder to maintain. And this is where confusion often enters, because prolonged fear consumes cognitive bandwidth. When mental resources are repeatedly allocated toward monitoring threat, less capacity remains available for organized thinking. Thoughts begin scattering. Focus weakens. Priorities blur. Decision-making becomes harder. This is what mental confusion often feels like. Not lack of intelligence, not lack of ability, but overload. Too many competing signals. Too much unresolved tension. Too much attention captured by instability. This fragmentation is draining. Even simple tasks can begin feeling disproportionately difficult when the internal system is overloaded. This is why Psalm 46 makes such a powerful declaration. God is in the midst of her. Midst suggests center, not peripheral support, not distant assistance, but central stabilizing presence. This is psychologically significant because when confusion increases, the center often feels lost. There is a sense of internal displacement, as though thoughts are no longer organized around a stable core. Instead, everything feels reactive, pulled in multiple directions, by fear, by uncertainty, by competing possibilities and unresolved tension. This creates internal movement, and too much movement creates instability. This is why the next phrase matters. She shall not be moved. Movement here is symbolic. Not physical relocation, but internal displacement. A loss of groundedness, a shift away from center. This is often what fear attempts, to move attention away from stability and toward chaos, to reorganize thought around uncertainty, to make pressure the new center. But Psalm 46 rejects this. The presence at the center creates anchoring, and anchoring reduces unnecessary movement. This is essential because systems function best when centered. A centered system processes information more effectively. A thought is clearer, emotion is less volatile, decision-making becomes more intentional. This is not because problems disappear. It is because internal organization improves. This is what being not moved accomplishes. It preserves structural integrity. External events may fluctuate, but the internal framework remains more intact. This reduces fragmentation, and reduced fragmentation is one of the most practical advantages under pressure. A fragmented mind struggles to prioritize. Everything feels equally urgent. Everything competes for attention. This creates fatigue, but centered systems can organize complexity more effectively. They distinguish signal from noise. They prioritize what matters. They conserve energy by reducing unnecessary mental dispersion. This is why grounding is so powerful. Grounding is not avoidance. It is regulated presence. Remaining connected to center while engaging reality. This changes the experience of pressure dramatically. Without grounding, pressure expands internally. It occupies disproportionate space. But with grounding, pressure is contextualized, still present, still real, but no longer total. This restores perspective. And perspective reduces fear amplification. Fear often makes challenges feel absolute, as though instability is all-encompassing. But perspective reminds the system, this is one condition, not the whole reality. This subtle shift is powerful, because totalizing perception increases overwhelm, but contextualized perception increases manageability. This is what internal anchoring supports. a stronger ability to hold complexity without collapsing under it. This is mental resilience, not suppression of emotion, not pretending difficulty is absent, but maintaining enough internal organization that difficulty does not create full psychological takeover. This is a skill, and Psalm 46 models it through center-based stability. Presence in the midst, a stabilizing force at the core. This makes the difference. Not because all variables are controlled, but because center is maintained. This is how fear loses some of its power, not by being argued away intellectually alone, but by reducing the internal conditions that allow it to dominate. When center is strong, thought slows, breathing deepens, attention becomes less chaotic. This creates room for clarity to return. And clarity is one of the greatest antidotes to confusion, because confusion thrives in overload, but clarity restores organization. What matters becomes more visible. What is noise becomes easier to filter. This improves action quality. Decisions become less emotionally reactive, more measured, more grounded, more aligned. This is the practical effect of not being moved, not rigidity, but stability at center. A system no longer easily displaced by every wave of external pressure. This is the deeper wisdom of Psalm 46 in this section. The greatest victory is often not immediate elimination of all challenges. It is preservation of internal order while challenges exist. Because once internal order is protected, fear loses momentum, confusion weakens, mental fragmentation decreases, and the person becomes far harder to destabilize. This is what it means. God in the midst, center restored, foundation strengthened, movement reduced, and a mind once pulled in many directions begins returning to stability, clarity, and internal strength strong enough to withstand pressure without surrendering to fear or mental confusion. He makes war cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariot in the fire. Psalm 46 now shifts from internal stabilization to dismantling. This progression is important. Before disruption is addressed externally, stability is first restored internally. Once the internal system is less governed by fear, confusion, and reactivity, perception becomes clearer. And clearer perception allows recognition of what is actually creating resistance. This verse uses the language of warfare, but its deeper symbolism is structural. Wars represent sustained conflict, not isolated moments of pressure, but ongoing patterns of friction, tension, and repeated disruption. This is significant because many destabilizing experiences are not defined by one singular event. They are cumulative, repeated cycles of opposition, repeated friction in progress, repeated tension that seems to keep systems in a state of strain. Over time, sustained conflict becomes draining, not only because of the external demands, but because constant resistance consumes energy. Attention becomes divided between moving forward and managing disruption. This creates exhaustion, and exhaustion reduces capacity. Decision fatigue increases, patience decreases, strategic clarity weakens. This is one reason sustained resistance feels so heavy. Not merely because something difficult is present, but because difficulty has become ongoing. This is what wars symbolize, extended conflict. But Psalm 46 makes a bold declaration. He makes war cease. Cease is an interruption word. It implies termination of continuity. Something ongoing is no longer allowed to continue indefinitely. This matters because one of the most exhausting aspects of prolonged resistance is the sense of endlessness. The feeling that conflict has no clear end point, that tension may simply continue indefinitely. This perception intensifies fatigue, but interruption changes psychological experience. Once continuity is broken, the system can begin reorganizing. This is why cessation matters so much. Not merely temporary reduction of pressure, but interruption of repeated destabilizing cycles. This is where the imagery intensifies. He breaks the bow. The bow is a projection instrument. It represents capacity to launch force from a distance. Symbolically, this matters. Not all resistance is immediate or obvious. Some forms operate indirectly. Pressure that accumulates gradually, influences that affect from a distance, dynamics that create strain without always appearing directly. The bow represents these forms of projected disruption. Breaking the bow symbolizes disabling mechanism, not merely absorbing impact, but interrupting the system generating it. This is a major shift because true relief rarely comes only from managing symptoms. It comes from weakening the structures producing them. This is why the next phrase continues. And cuts the spear in two. The spear represents directed force, precision pressure, a tool designed for penetration. Symbolically, this can represent focused destabilization, not generalized chaos, but targeted points of pressure, areas where disruption feels unusually concentrated. The cutting of the spear signifies interruption of penetration capacity. What once had force to pierce no longer functions as designed. Again, the theme is not merely resistance, but dismantling of resistance mechanisms. This is strategic, because systems are strongest when their tools remain intact. But once tools are disrupted, system effectiveness decreases, and decreased effectiveness changes the balance. This is why the final image matters. He burns the chariot in the fire. The chariot symbolizes mobility, speed, and operational capacity. A chariot allows systems of force to move efficiently. Burning it represents disabling infrastructure, not only removing one tool, but weakening operational continuity. This is powerful symbolism, because some forms of resistance are sustained not only by isolated tactics, but by entire reinforcing systems, patterns, structures, habitual cycles, and lasting change often requires disruption at this level, not only reducing one symptom while the larger system remains active, but interrupting the infrastructure supporting repetition. This is what Psalm 46 portrays. Not endless management of conflict, but progressive dismantling. This is psychologically important, because under sustained pressure, many people unconsciously adapt to permanent resistance. Conflict becomes normalized. Tension becomes baseline. Disruption becomes expected. And once normalized, internal energy begins organizing around management rather than transformation. But Psalm 46 reintroduces another possibility. What has been ongoing can be interrupted. What feels structurally reinforced can be weakened. What appears operationally powerful is not necessarily permanent. This restores possibility, because learned helplessness often develops under prolonged resistance. Repeated difficulty without perceived resolution reduces motivation. Why invest effort if the system feels unchangeable? But interruption changes this. Once continuity breaks, agency begins returning. Energy becomes more available again, because attention is no longer consumed entirely by perpetual management. This frees cognitive and emotional resources. Resources can shift from defense back toward growth. This is critical, because systems trapped in constant defense struggle to expand. Too much energy is allocated toward protection. But once destabilizing patterns weaken, expansion becomes more possible. Focus broadens. Capacity increases. Momentum can begin rebuilding. This is why dismantling matters. Not simply symbolic victory, functional liberation, reduced friction, reduced tension load, reduced operational pressure. This changes everything, because what once consumed everyone, almost internal bandwidth, begins losing influence. And when influence decreases, clarity improves, stamina increases, strategic thinking returns. This is the deeper message of this section. Not all resistance deserves permanence in perception. What feels ongoing is not automatically eternal. What feels reinforced can still be dismantled. Tools can be broken. Systems can weaken. Patterns can cease. And once cessation begins, a profound shift occurs. Internal vigilance can soften. Mental resources can recover. Energy can reallocate toward movement rather than endless management. This is the collapse of hidden resistance, not necessarily dramatic in appearance, but deeply consequential in effect, because once the mechanisms sustaining pressure begin failing, what once felt overwhelming starts losing coherence, losing operational strength, and losing the ability to continue generating the same level of disruption. Be still and know that I am God. After describing chaos, instability, conflict, and the dismantling of disruptive systems, Psalm 46 now introduces one of its most well-known and powerful commands: stillness. This placement is intentional. Stillness appears after pressure is acknowledged, not before it. This matters because stillness is often misunderstood. It is not denial of difficulty. It is not passive disengagement. It is not pretending that challenges do not exist. Stillness in Psalm 46 is disciplined internal stabilization, a deliberate refusal to let chaos dictate internal rhythm. This is important because pressure naturally accelerates the system. When instability rises, the mind speeds up, thought loops intensify, scenario analysis increases. Attention becomes more fragmented as it attempts to monitor multiple uncertainties simultaneously. This acceleration can feel productive. More thinking may seem like more control, but often excessive acceleration decreases clarity. Thought becomes noisy rather than useful. Distinguishing signal from noise becomes harder. Emotion and cognition become more entangled. This is where stillness becomes essential. Stillness interrupts unnecessary acceleration. It slows the system, not to eliminate awareness, but to restore order. This is psychologically powerful because clarity rarely emerges from chronic internal noise. A system overwhelmed by speed often struggles to organize. Unease information effectively. Everything feels urgent. Everything competes for attention. And when everything feels urgent, prioritization collapses. Stillness restores hierarchy. It reduces internal congestion. Mental traffic begins slowing. This creates space. And space is essential for accurate perception. Without space, reaction dominates. With space, reflection becomes possible. This is why stillness is not inactivity. It is operational clarity. A more organized internal environment. This is what allows the second part of the verse. And knowledge here is not merely intellectual awareness. It is recognition, reorientation, a return to accurate hierarchy. Pressure often distorts hierarchy. The immediate problem begins feeling ultimate. The current instability feels larger than everything else. Attention becomes consumed by what is loudest. This is understandable, but loudness is not the same as ultimate authority. Stillness helps re-establish this distinction. By reducing internal noise, it becomes easier to recognize what is actually central, what is stable, what is enduring, what deserves primary orientation. This is what know implies. Not merely remembering an abstract fact, but reorganizing perception around a higher reference point. This is critical because orientation determines experience. What occupies the highest level of internal authority shapes emotional response. If chaos becomes highest authority, fear increases, reactivity increases, perspective narrows. But if a higher stabilizing authority is restored to center, pressure becomes contextualized, still real, still requiring engagement, but no longer ultimate. This changes emotional climate dramatically. Problems feel less totalizing. Mental bandwidth begins reopening. Decision-making improves. This is the power of hierarchy restoration. The mind functions better when internal order is accurate. Not every variable deserves equal weight. Not every uncertainty deserves primary focus. Stillness makes this visible again. It allows recalibration. What matters most rises. What is noise becomes easier to filter. This improves strategic function. A clearer system allocates resources better. Attention becomes more precise. Energy is less wasted. Reaction decreases. This creates efficiency. And efficiency matters under pressure because pressure already consumes resources. Wasted cognitive energy compounds exhaustion. Stillness reduces waste. Less unnecessary rumination. Less emotional escalation. Less fragmented focus. This preserves capacity. And preserved capacity increases resilience. This is one reason stillness is often difficult. A dysregulated system may initially resist slowing down. Acceleration can feel safer, as though continuous movement maintains control. But uncontrolled acceleration often weakens control instead. Stillness feels unfamiliar precisely because it interrupts automatic patterns. This interruption is valuable. It reveals internal habits, where attention defaults, how fear organizes thought, what narratives dominate perception. Awareness increases, and awareness creates choice. Without stillness, many reactions remain automatic, but stillness introduces conscious regulation, a pause in the momentum of chaos. This allows intentionality to re-enter, intentional thought, intentional emotional regulation, intentional response selection. This is internal authority, no longer being passively carried by the emotional current of instability. Instead, re-engaging from ground, deadness. This is what stillness makes possible. Not disengagement from life, but stronger engagement through clearer regulation. This changes everything because many external challenges are made harder by internal disorganization. But when internal organization improves, problems become more manageable. Complexity feels less overwhelming. Options become more visible. This does not necessarily change circumstances instantly, but it changes relationship to circumstances. And that shift is powerful. A person operating from stillness engages differently. Less panic, less haste, less chaos amplification. more discernment, more centered action, more sustainable strength. This is the deeper invitation of Psalm 46. Not merely to pause externally, but to reorganize internally, to reduce noise enough to restore hierarchy, to remember what remains stable when everything else feels loud. Because once internal hierarchy is restored, chaos loses some of its dominance. Pressure loses some of its psychological control. Fear loses some of its organizing role. And what returns is stronger perception, a clearer center, a steadier internal environment. This is what it means to be still, not frozen, not passive, but internally ordered enough to recognize that no matter how intense current pressure appears, it is not the highest authority governing the outcome. And once that recognition stabilizes, something powerful happens. Thought slows, breath deepens. The internal system begins returning to strength, and clarity becomes available again, not because chaos disappeared, but because stillness restored the ability to see beyond it. This is the moment where understanding becomes decision, because insight alone does not create transformation. A truth recognized but never applied remains intellectually interesting but practically inactive. Awareness can illuminate patterns, reveal internal dynamics, and expose what has been creating instability, but without intentional response, old systems often continue operating. This is why Psalm 46 does not end merely with reassurance. It ends with positioning, a call to stand, not physically but internally, to become structurally aligned with what has been revealed throughout the psalm. Stand firm. This phrase is simple but deeply important, because pressure often creates movement, not always visible movement, but internal displacement. Fear moves attention, chaos moves emotion, confusion moves perception. Without noticing, the internal system can gradually relocate away from center, away from clarity, away from groundedness, away from intentional action. This is what instability often attempts, not merely to create difficulty, but to create disorganization, because disorganized systems are easier to overwhelm. This is why standing firm matters. It is refusal of unnecessary internal movement, a commitment to remain aligned, not rigidly frozen, not emotionally numb, but anchored, stable enough that external conditions do not automatically dictate internal state. This is strength, not domination over circumstances, but regulation within circumstances. This is often more powerful than people realize, because external control is limited. Not every event can be managed. Not every variable can be predicted, but internal alignment remains highly influential. How attention is directed, how emotion is regulated, how decisions are made under pressure. These shape outcomes significantly, and they are strengthened through standing firm. This is why the next instruction on is essential. Reject fear. Fear may arise naturally under uncertainty, but arising is different from agreement. Not every emotion deserves authority. Fear can signal perceived threat, but it does not automatically deserve leadership. This distinction changes everything. Many systems become unintentionally governed by fear simply because fear is treated as the most urgent internal voice. If fear says retreat, retreat feels necessary. If fear says panic, panic feels justified. But Psalm 46 repeatedly interrupts this pattern. Fear is acknowledged but not enthroned. This is maturity, not pretending fear is absent, but refusing to let it become the central organizing force. This refusal is practical. It changes attention. Instead of becoming fully consumed by threat scanning, attention can be redirected toward what is functional, what is needed now, what is controllable, what is aligned. This improves operational quality, less wasted energy, less unnecessary amplification, more intentional response. This is what rejecting fear creates, not recklessness, but clearer functioning. This naturally supports the final instruction. Walk in strength. Strength here is not intensity, it is capacity. The ability to continue functioning well under load, to maintain coherence under pressure, to preserve intentionality under uncertainty. This is what many people actually need most. Not the elimination of all difficulty immediately, but restoration of operational strength. Because depleted systems struggle. Even manageable tasks feel heavier, but strengthened systems regain capacity, more focus, more emotional bandwidth, more resilience. Walking in strength means moving forward from this stronger internal state, not remaining psychologically trapped in prior instability, not continually revisiting the same fear loops, not allowing old chaos patterns to remain default. Instead, forward movement, guided by stronger internal structure. This is important because after intense pressure, systems sometimes remain oriented around defense even after conditions begin shifting. Hypervigilance can linger. Protective habits may remain overactive. This is understandable. But long-term growth requires eventual reorientation, not endless defense. Movement. This is what walk implies. Progress, measured, intentional, grounded. The NTIC acceleration. Not reactive movement, but aligned advancement. This is deeply empowering because it reframes the relationship to pressure. Pressure is no longer the defining force. It becomes context, not identity. A condition to navigate, not a totalizing reality. This restores agency, and agency is essential. When agency is weak, helplessness increases. But when agency returns, options become more visible. Choice becomes more active. Energy begins reorganizing toward constructive action. This creates momentum, and momentum is powerful. Not because everything changes instantly, but because systems moving intentionally tend to strengthen over time. Repeated alignment compounds. Repeated grounded action compounds. Repeated rejection of fear-based governance compounds. This is how transformation becomes structural. Not through one isolated emotional moment, but through consistent embodied alignment. This is the final invitation of Psalm 46. Do not merely admire stability, practice it. Do not merely understand strength conceptually, build it behaviorally. Do not merely recognize fear, refuse its unnecessary authority. This is the call. Stand when cow. S attempts displacement. Reject fear when uncertainty seeks control. Walk forward with restored strength and clearer internal order, because pressure is real, but it is not ultimate. Instability is disruptive, but not sovereign. Chaos may be loud, but loudness is not authority. And once this becomes deeply internalized, something powerful begins happening. The internal system changes, less easily shaken, less easily fragmented, less easily governed by external intensity. What emerges instead is stronger alignment, clearer perception, greater resilience, and a quieter confidence rooted not in perfect conditions, but in a foundation stronger than disruption itself. This is how Psalm 46 ends, not with surrender to pressure, but with a deliberate commitment to remain anchored, reject fear, and keep walking in strength no matter how loud the chaos becomes.